We're going to talk today about outsourcing. You heard from Steve's address earlier, there is a significant need for transformation in the industry. Volume is not going up, competition is the same, regulation is greater than anything, and the only thing that can give in that equation at the moment, I think, is the cost block that we need to address. The panel, I'm not going to introduce them. They're very seasoned professionals. You've obviously got Bob from Broadridge. Broadridge, in terms of outsourcing, I think has, I forget the market share in the US, but it's very significant in the securities industry. They're by far a market leader in that space. Increasingly so in the European space. You've got Tony from DTCC. They've been very proactive from what I see over the years in terms of collaboration and trying to drive standards. Obviously, they're an infrastructure, so they've got a different remit. And obviously, Steve, from a consulting perspective, helping companies understand their challenges in the transformation. So I thought I'd kick off with just a very simple question. You know, we heard in Steve's address there is a significant need. From Bob and then Tony, what are you actually seeing from clients? Is that consulting view translate into what the client sees?
So look, listening to the MiFID presentation just kind of plays into how I was going to talk about this today, right? If you look at most banks that have global footprints, they have what I would call very disparate and fragmented infrastructure, right? And on top of that, that fragmentation, allows, unfortunately, the reduction of cost to be very difficult because you have operations teams, you have technology teams supporting different back office systems in different regions around the globe, and the regulatory amount of work that they have to do, it just becomes prohibitive for them to continue to do business in that way. So really, I think the goal and the challenge is how do you look at global operating models? How do you look at global platforms to allow for an opportunity to create efficiency both operationally and from a technology perspective, and to reduce the amount of cost associated with actually running that. On top of it, there's other benefits around, by having a global platform, around getting real-time data, real-time positions and balances, real-time P&L, that often they don't have today. So it is really around the technology investment that I think is going to be crucial. I think the days of firms building out their own platforms, I think are, unfortunately, they're not going to be able to do that. So they really do need to look for partners who could actually not only deliver that capability, but continue to invest in it over the long term.
And is it just a cost driver you see, or is it operational risk? If I look at a study, I think the HSBC did maybe 18 months ago, 2 years now, it concluded across, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 companies that the average age of a securities platform was 30 years plus. If I think about what that means in terms of people, I guess that means that you've got a lot of people with an average age of somewhere mid-50s coming rolling off the platform in the next years. So are you seeing it just from a cost driver or also management of operational risk?
Yeah, I would say both. Clearly cost is, you mentioned shrinking margins, right? Lower volume, et cetera. So you really have to do more with less. And it really is about scale, right? And, the beauty about mutualizing cost, which is really, I think where people have to look, is building once and applying to many when you have commoditized functions, whether it's processing an equity or processing a fixed income. There's really no differentiation around doing that, right? So some of the risk, though, is around by having these fragmented infrastructures. People were mentioning legal entities, right? It's absolutely shocking to me when I look at some of the clients that we do business with. Some of it's historic, some of it's legacy through acquisitions. They have just an enormous amount of legal entities, right, which creates its own challenges and risks. And one of the things that I'll just give you an example of something we did with one of our clients where, again, it's around partnering, and I only say this because I think this is a common issue. It's not just something that Broadridge was able to solve. They had a U.S. broker-dealer. They had a London branch trading U.S. corporate securities. And amazingly, they were actually clearing those through a custodian in the U.S. and not leveraging their own broker-dealer. And it was a pretty simple thing around creating, right? We have the ability to do intercompany trades and actually create that offsetting transaction into that US broker-dealer, which already has an account at DTC. They saved $4 million by doing that alone. So there is operational efficiencies and issues that are based on how you're using technology and how you're partnering with your providers.
And Tony, what do you see?
Well, the driver we haven't mentioned so far is, I think, the ability to comply with new regulations and a changing business landscape. I'll give you a couple of practical examples. Collateral management being a good example. There's very heavily involved in a big project with Euroclear on collateral management, and clients' ability to automate this segment of the market varies enormously. There are major buy-side firms that run their margin processing operations on Excel. They're sending emails to people. They're making errors every single day. They're having reconciliation problems. They're having transaction reporting problems with their regulators because they have a very, very agricultural level of automation in the collateral management area. Bob just mentioned legal entities. If you look at LEI, LEI is such a obviously good idea for the industry, and yet it's endured, not embraced, is the phrase that I tend to use. The level of LEI adoption in Asia Pacific is extremely low. Only 4% of all LEIs in the world are Asia Pacific, and 3% come from Japan. Now, they may not feel that they need the LEI system on a domestic basis, but they sure do need it on a global basis, particularly when the next crisis arrives. And yet, it's been very, very reluctantly taken up by the local market. So if you've got an aged platform, very old technology, multiple platforms acquired through acquisition and mergers, which have not been properly consolidated, your ability to comply with new regulation, there's numerous other areas, is much more difficult than it could be if you were using something up to date, something that you were collaborating and sharing with other segments of the industry. And the third one I'll mention, which is probably not yet an issue for most firms here in the ISITC membership, but will trickle down, is cybersecurity. RE being in the US, what's designated as a SIFMA, we're a financial market utility, very highly regulated. We're having to comply with what's called a 2-hour RTO, return to operations, in the event of a cyber attack. Now, we've got very mixed feelings about that, because we've proved that we can get back up and running in 2 hours, but we may not know what caused us to go down in the first place. So there's a risk in being able to get back up in 2 hours. That requirement will inevitably trickle down to our clients. Now, if you've got very, very old technology, are you able to recover from a cyber attack in a 2-hour window? I don't know, but it's probably much less likely than if you're able to use much more modern technology that's understandable and coherent.
Yeah. And Steve, I think you guys are about to launch at Cybos a big information pack around outsourcing. What do you see from the client side? Obviously, you see the need for transformation, but how do you see them going about it? Outsourcing is not something that's been new. It's been around for 15, 20 years and has never really worked very well. It works very well in the US, but with the fragmentation in Europe, it's been less successful. So what do you see clients needing?
Yeah, so we did a survey. We interviewed 32 CEOs, ExCo members, to understand what is the expectation on the market. And it highlights a lot of different things, where obviously even myself, I was thinking that the market was very mature and looking for simplification and consolidation. And the results show, one, there is a very high expectation on outsourcing. And compared to the US, which is a very mature market where leadership on cash securities obviously has emerged, in Europe, because of fragmentation, because of different regulation, it is not yet the case. And as a consequence, the expectation which is coming from the US on this very high maturity of processes and commoditization is not yet there in Europe, but create the same expectation. And therefore, you have a lot of supply which is not matching the demand. So one example to highlight on your point, the demand is to transform and to ensure that you are going to have something which is going to avoid future costs that you can not bear yourself anymore. The question is, what's the preference? One of the questions was, what's the preference? Do you prefer to go on a business process outsourcing, IT outsourcing, leveraging your own technology and providing that to the service with supplier? Or do you prefer to jump directly to the supplier platform and therefore potentially join even a one-to-many solution? And obviously, it was very interesting to see that half will prefer to go on the one-to-many. However, because of the transition risk and cost, they were certainly looking for half of them as a first step to take on their own platform. So that's the issue, because obviously everyone is looking for this transformation. Everyone is looking for the mutualization and capability to share cost, but the danger, the risk of the transition and the cost is so high that sometimes they just prefer to go on that platform. This is nuanced depending on the tier of the bank, of course. The smaller one will certainly look for going directly to a mutualization, long-term platform that the supplier is providing.
And one of the things that I always see is there is definitely a need for transformation, and obviously outsourcing is the way forward, or smart sourcing, however you want to describe it. One of the things that I think is definitely the challenge of organisations is their ability to transform. And I'm interested in your comments, Bob. I mean, you see this day in, day out. I guess you started with the model, we do a commercial arrangement, and then we start implementation, and then it goes one way, this way, that way. How do you help
They always go great, by the way.
Yeah, they always go great.
On time and under budget.
But how do you look at helping banks and organisations transform now?
Yeah.
What help do you give them?
I really want to comment on what my colleague here said, because it's actually interesting around the challenges that firms have. So in the U.S., and I think this is what you're going to see in Europe, by the way, there needs to be someone who becomes the main winner, right? Because it does create that critical mass. So, we're fortunate enough in the U.S. to have the market share that we do. And part of that advantage, interestingly, is, we actually have a broker-dealer. It was something when we were in the clearing business, we exited that. And my point around this story is I think there needs to be, and hopefully it's going to be someone who's going to invest. By having that broker-dealer, FINRA actually audits the services that we're providing to the end client. So you're getting this double audit. So it just, that makes people extraordinarily comfortable. It also means that the people who work in our kind of outsourcing BPO actually sit on the SIPMA committee. So we're getting, we're the leading and at the same table as our clients around all the different market changes, and that's very advantageous. I don't see that here in Europe, and I think it's because there's been, this reluctance or just lack of enough players to actually get that critical mass. And once you have that critical mass, I think that whole transition, the reason to not do it, the disruption to the business, the amount of cost that's associated with doing it, the fear of just change just in general, I think it becomes an easier decision. So I would hope, and I think the challenge is as organizations, how do we actually create that critical mass? How do we create it so that it's actually a very, very easy decision for clients to say, you know what, there isn't going to be the risk is lower because 6 other firms have done it and they look exactly like us. Their business isn't that different.
Well, one thing I've seen recently is that I run a business which is execution to custody, right? So I see the trading side, I see the settlement side. And one of the sectors that I support is wealth management. And I'm picking that one out, right? Brokerage, I think that there is fragmentation all over the place because people still have their own system, right? And
Yeah.
But on the wealth management side, I see a big shift to a couple of vendors, okay? And we're talking about people not moving from their existing vendor because they didn't have one. So they were the spreadsheet, they were the, they're the smaller kind of, but I think the driver for that is actually not the fact that they want to transform, it's actually the fact that they've actually merged, they've been buying up and the wealth management sector is very hot for M&A at the moment, right? So I think that there's a lot of M&A going on in that industry, which is driving consolidation around a single platform. It's a couple of players out there. But I also think that it's also fragmented from the order management system because they don't actually have front to back systems. So they slot in order management systems, they slot in PA systems. You know, it's still that kind of one hub solution. I'm interested to see, you know, what you guys see as the appetite for the types of outsourcing. You already mentioned, you know, IT outsourcing, BPO. What's the next outsourcing? What is a smart sourcing? Where is that going? What is it we can expect to see?
So, well, I'll answer from our perspective. You know, what we're seeing is a couple things which are very interesting. When you get critical mass, you could start doing things like what we're calling the network effect, right? Where we're actually can see the amount of trades being done in corporate bonds, for instance, and actually could pair off these trades on behalf of our clients and actually shorten settlement cycles and reduce the amount of capital required at depositories, right? So there's some really exciting stuff that we're doing around what we're calling the network effect. You know, the other is really around investing in technology to actually do more with less. You know, you have to have a partnership where that partner is actually willing to use their balance sheet to actually continue to invest in technology. So I know it's been mentioned, are implementing and working with machine learning and, you know, artificial intelligence just in general, because if you don't do that, you're going to be left in the dust. So, and you could kind of see how the BPO went from the labor arbitrage to marrying technology platforms with people and that subject matter expertise around how you could look at a client's business and say, we have ways to actually save you money above and beyond, and it's a win situation for both. So we have this concept of gain sharing, and it really is invaluable. So in concept, the way that it works is to identify inefficiencies based on trade flows, legal entity structures, how you're doing your business. And if we could figure out and make an investment, we're going to share in the actual win associated with that.
It's monolistic like you are in that marketplace. That's easy for you to see. I mean, this audience here, I'm guessing that they all use, if they are in banks, they're all using different applications.
No, absolutely. And I'm saying, I think, so the question was, you know, how do you see that, you know, in the future? And I think that's what you're going to see. I think you're going to see an evolution toward people that have those capabilities and getting more market share and creating that scale and then applying all that investing to it to create the same type of model. I mean, that's really what I was getting at.
Nigel, I would say it's as much about what people don't want to do as what they do want to do. There's a huge range of psychological viewpoints, and particularly in the buy side, for example. So, I mean, Rob, a few minutes ago, you said outsourcing is clearly the way forward. There are some very, very significant buy side firms that don't want to do any outsourcing at all. They build everything. They actually see it as a commercial opportunity. They may be buying more technology platforms from vendors rather than building themselves, which is a clear trend. But actually, they've said, no, we're good at this. We want to make it a value add. It aids client satisfaction, etc., etc. So we are not outsourcing. We are building up our capabilities in middle and back office. And then there's a massive spread over to the other end of the spectrum, which is, no, we can't be bothered with this anymore. The investment management has become incredibly complicated, more and more regulation, more demanding clients. If you're a UK asset management company, you've got the FCA bearing down on you in terms of cost issues, cost and pricing transparency issues that have been referred to the...
And outsourcing, strangely enough.
Yes, yes, you've been referred to the Competition and Markets Authority, which is not a very comfortable place to be referred to. So there is a big trend towards more pricing and cost transparency in the buy side, which you probably need decent technology to provide that level of cost transparency. So there's a huge spectrum here, but
there is.
Not everybody's terribly interested in outsourcing. What the industry needs to do more outsourcing on the Broadridge type model is in Europe is more standardized process. And so you look in the settlement market, Target 2 Securities may be the driver of that standardized settlement. It's taking a very, very long time, and it needs to do asset servicing on top of the pure settlement model to create a proper
I think it just
European...
depends. It depends how mature you are in understanding where you differentiate and what you can, you know, that's why outsourcing is a very emotive topic to lots of people. It can mean many different things.
Yes, absolutely.
It could just mean the inclusion of fintech. and how you do that. Steve, do you have any comments?
Yes. The first point is on the comment on outsourcing. It's very interesting to see that obviously a lot of the market maturity is coming to say that outsourcing is a given. But our study shows that the value of outsourcing is not yet demonstrated. Specifically, what we heard is that it has been good and providing a one-off cost saving, that's for sure, but big frustration and unexpected, or let's say unmanaged expectation on continuity improvement, continuous improvement of the cost and the ability to provide variable costs or cost avoidance. So there is this point that first, compared to some of the major players who have done offshoring with captive center, are not yet at a situation where they consider that what they have done in outsourcing is better. They consider that the one-off cost saving was good, but from a long-term perspective,
It's a short-term fix.
it complexified the management of all the different parties. It's not really a variable cost, to my point before, it's even more a fixed cost in some cases. And therefore there is an expectation to say, 1-1 outsourcing, not that good. I want a one-to-many. But then the one who have done one-to-many, and except in the US, again, the value is not demonstrated, or even the platform is not demonstrated to be a true one-to-many. So the expectation is here. I think the maturity is there, but the supply is not yet matching the demand. Back to also the point, most of the solution that we see our clients willing to find, considering the complexity of transformation, is to say, let's go greenfield. And obviously, when you look at clouds, when you look at all different fintech or the capability to build greenfield, it's very appealing. But that's very complex. And back to the point is, how do you transform? How do you dedicate capabilities and budget to a low greenfield approach while you are still running on your old legacy? And that's where outsourcing can help, because in some cases, you have some suppliers coming with a greenfield solution or a kind of solution which is providing a totally different capabilities to the one you will be able to provide. And back to your question, I think the market is demanding more and more collaboration, hence the point of mutualization and certainly utilities. But utilities like we hear, what is really utilities, market infrastructure utilities, DTCC is a good example, I think.
We're trying.
Not trying. However, we don't see yet the market really going there. And therefore, because you need to reduce costs, everyone is looking back to software vendor, service provider, or even some player.
Yeah, but my point early on is the fact that Jack Welch always said re-engineer before you kind of integrate, right? So that's logic, right? But we're not doing that.
No.
Right? We don't have that comfort to do that. We have to do BAU and then change, right? I guess the gap that I see is, what's it going to change to? I don't see anyone standing up and saying this is what it's going to look like in the future. And that's what I want us to decide as an industry. What's it going to look like in the future? That's what I want to know, right? Because then you can take an estimated guess, a good guess, of the way in which you want to actually change the way in which you want to operate.
But Nigel, the track record of that type of collaborative project is very patchy indeed.
It's not something that you're going to have to utilitize, right? What you're going to do is you're going to I agree with you. We're all looking at certain things, right? But we never look at it that way round, right? You're not going to build it. You're just going to agree what that future looks like. Then you can build towards it. It's not a GSTPA. That's the truth.
I still want to come back to. I still want to come back to the point of transformation because I think it's an important one. But let's just carry on this theme. If we agree then that actually if you outsource, it's a short-term delivery out of cost. It gives you and it enables you to standardise. I guess the question is how do we, Bob, from your perspective, and again from Tony from DTCC, how do you incorporate and keep current those environments to include the latest fintechs and the latest software and AI and everything? How do you keep people up to date with not only just transforming for the short-term cost, but then to take them forward and propel them to the new model?
Yeah, look, that's always the challenge,
Yeah.
right? Because again, business as usual is business as usual. It's the same people that you need on the client side to actually help, upgrade or move, that are running, their day-to-day jobs, right? So there's always this kind of, contentious, how do you actually do this? It is about planning. It is about making sure you have the right programs in place and the right phasing and really work together to actually do that. That certainly helps. But at the end of the day, you have to partner with someone who's going to be making those investments. I mean, that is really what it's all about. Whoever it is that you choose to help you in that transformation has to have a roadmap of 5 years and 10 years around where they see technology, where they see themselves, whether it's going to be moving to the cloud, whether they have a program around how they're doing artificial intelligence and machine learning, how they're trying to create a network effect or a gain share model where there's constant alignment around the client and the provider, making sure that there's alignment around creating and continuing to make efficiencies. In the previous iterations, some firms would just say, we'll guarantee a 2% savings every year, no matter what, over this 10-year deal or 7-year deal. And I think that's just not fit for purpose anymore. It really is around picking the right people that have a model where it's like, look, if we could find ways, based on the way that you're set up, to actually recommend, setting it up differently and actually creating those efficiencies, we're to share in that savings. That alignment, I think, is very powerful.
And obviously, one thing that you guys are very good at is that standardized operating environment and driving that efficiency. But how do you introduce then things like
Which clients always, it seems like we all do the same business,
Yeah.
but it's always a different flavor of
It's
that same
always a
business,
different
right?
flavour. But how do you, for example, do you look at blockchain technology? Do you look at AI now to supplement your model? How do you?
Well, we look at all those things because and the reason why we do that is our market position, the amount of business that we do and the firms that we do it for globally. We can't just be sitting back. We will be left in the dust if we don't do that. So, whether it's Broadridge's proxy business or whether it's our processing business or outsourcing, we are constantly, using our balance sheet to actually reinvest in people and in technology so that we continue to do that. Our partnership with Accenture is exactly based on that. We're making all that technology investment. They're going to benefit from that and what they provide to their clients. So, again, we're not the only ones that do that, but I think if I'm on the other side as a client looking at who I want to do business with, it is those types of firms that actually have the balance sheet and that do invest and have a vision around that 5 to 10 years on how they're going to use technology to be better.
And Tony, from a DTCC perspective?
Clients very rarely ever ask us about technology. I'm looking at Charlie here. Do they ever ask you about? Yeah, they're interested in business value, and I mean we have 2 projects in what we used to call blockchain and we now call distributed ledger technology. We're involved in robotic process automation ourselves, as are a significant number of clients, particularly on the broker-dealer side. They are investing heavily in robotics to sort out business issues, practical, non-STP, manual processing business issues. It's clearly got a lot of traction, but it's very rarely ever technology-driven, Rob. It's driven by, can you do something better? Can you do it cheaper? Can you do it more collaboratively? So, the two.
So the client doesn't care how you do it; they just want the delivery.
They're not really bothered about whether it's a distributed ledger technology database. They care about security, reliability, cost, value, all the traditional things. If it's built on blockchain technology, that may be. And Nigel's looking highly sceptical here, so maybe he's got something to say to me here.
I think it's quite interesting. 2 years ago, that DTCC and Euroclear were the first ones, actually in partnership with you guys, to issue a paper on DLT and how the future could look. That's what I guess that clients will be interested in, and that's where you drag them in, right? Because you then say, this is how we're going to use it. So they are interested in your technology, and I think like Broadridge, they're not going to be asking for a great big huge mainframe that may or may not go on the cloud. So I think it's interesting that they are interested in it, and you have to phrase it a way in which the clients can understand.
Things have changed a lot over the past couple of years, Nigel. So a couple of years ago, there was a lot of pontification about DTCC going out of business, and you don't need a market infrastructure. So that's why we did that thought leadership. But then we picked a couple of projects to decide to prove it, and those are going live next year and the year afterwards. So, but it's not the primary driver for clients at the moment as to what type of technology you're using. It's business value. that they are primarily interested in. And as going back to the point I was making earlier, the collaboration thing is a very common theme. Everybody says, yes, we've got to collaborate better, but there are numerous examples of shared platforms where governance was really the biggest issue, single biggest issue as to whether they succeed or don't succeed.
And Steve, you mentioned, I think in your presentation earlier, that there's a need for service providers, banks, if you will, a need to really engage better with their clients, become more technology focused. Could you elaborate on what you see in that area, from your research? And then I'm interested to see from Bob and Tony's perspective, how they enable that. So if I'm a service provider, how does Bob enable me to even be better to my clients? Not just in process, but is it via white labeling? Is it, extending technology solutions and, that type of thing? I'm interested to see what...
Yeah, so before the survey, we we had an assumption that the market is doing simplification and consolidation. Simplification of the architecture, simplification of the number of applications, consolidation front to back, and even in some cases cross-asset classes, post-trade processing. And therefore, we were thinking that the answer to the survey, we are going to ask for service provider to be able to outsource similarly consolidated front to back or post-trade processing cross-asset classes integrated. The answer from the survey shows in fact that yes, you have some clients looking for that, but that's not the majority. The majority are looking for best of breed. Why? Back to the point we discussed. One, they understand that they need to provide client services, they need to embed services, and they understand that they cannot just have a monolithic or whatever you call it solution, but they need to be very flexible and agile to provide services on a given platform. True, they understand that the maturity is not there, and therefore they need to be very agile to adopt either fintech, to your point. You can certainly integrate fintech or whatever kind of new technology as part of your architecture. And you can certainly look at some services or maturing services from different suppliers to be specifically answering some of your needs. So because you have this point of best of breed, some supplier will certainly be able to deconstruct or provide a modular architecture of their full front to back or post-trade processing cross-asset classes, and that will be great. But some are just very narrow, very niche on addressing this, and therefore you see a lot of different capabilities. But more important, if you think that any bank is going to be in a way in a collaboration, providing services to the other or consuming services from the others, then you are in a different mode, and you are not looking anymore at big chunk of outsourcing. You are really looking at, okay, how do I build services? What will I think I differentiate I want to own? Where do I think I don't have any differentiation I want to buy or I want to consume? And that's the changes we are seeing.
And Bob, obviously your company specialises in standardisation, stripping cost out, etc., etc. Are you seeing a demand from users of that to white label parts of that, or to enable clients to interact more freely, as opposed to, client interacts with bank with your service?
I mean, this is mostly post-trade, so when you're
Yeah,
asking me that,
post-trade,
I'm trying to think, no, I don't, it's, at least either that or I'm completely missing it, because I don't see anyone white labeling what we do. I think it's mostly, quite frankly, it's around standardizing and creating scale that they can never do themselves, right? I mean, that really is ultimately the driver, and that is the business outcome.
So you see the banks developing that end client tool and just plugging in.
Yeah, even
your
in our
systems.
outsourcing that we do, whether it's in Europe and Asia or it's in the US or Canada, that client-facing function is normally held and retained by the end client. More and more, we are starting to do some things to help facilitate on behalf of the client, to actually give them better data or access to information or dashboards so that they have a better customer experience with their end customer. But, at the end of the day, that's not really, the white labeling is not something that we've ever been asked to look at.
And Tony, from your perspective, not a need for that. You don't see a need.
No, I generally agree that the ownership of the client and the relationship with the client is your key advantage,
Yeah.
which nobody wants. I don't think very few people want to give that up. Depends what segment of the business you're in. If you look at the asset management industry, transfer agency, very large. You know, a lot of it is outsourced in Luxembourg and
Yeah.
Dublin, for example. So there's different levels of maturity in different segments. But if you're talking about trading securities, no, I don't see any of our clients willing to really give up their client relationships. They see client relationships as being the gold. You know, that's the gold
Yeah.
in their relationships. But they are no longer interested in building their own technology platforms to process
Sure.
those transactions. If they can share them with other people, they will do so.
Steve?
On white labeling, what we see is back to the asset monetization. We see some players, quite the big one, thinking that they have such a good asset that they can certainly sell it as part of a transaction and have the supplier to build on top of this offering a kind of one-to-many and providing this as a mutualized platform. And you see that in a lot of different cases with a lot of different banks.
Turning a cost into a revenue stream,
Yes,
potentially.
but sometimes it's just a lease back, sometimes it's just an asset monetization one-off, and sometimes it's more a partnership. So we see that. In some cases, obviously, the asset is not at the level that the industry is looking for, and therefore the experience is not that great, and it's more a transaction or kind of a way to buy the transaction. But in some cases, it has built a very specific niche kind of service because it has been quite good, and some users, some other players are asking for that. So this is the way I see white labeling. Another trend we see is obviously providers, banks, starting to become supplier and providing their own infrastructure as an IT outsourcing or as a business process outsourcing to others. We think it's quite complex. We think these kind of players don't realize that they are neither a software provider, neither they are a service provider, a supplier, and they will have very much difficulties to just match the client demand in terms of SLAs and KPIs and commercial management, which is very complex. And therefore, what they start to realize, back to the point of API, is that they can certainly offer part of it as a service. And here you see again some fragmentation. Do you call that white labeling? Do you call that providing through API part of your best of breed solution? I don't know, but there is a trend here.
Okay.
By the way, clients always like to say that they built something unique and special. And,
Yes.
and that as part of the transaction, if you could absorb it. And look, we do look at those things because, you know, we don't do everything for everyone, and sometimes they do. The issue, though, is always to make it scale, it really has to be multi-entity, and the work involved in kind of either replatforming it or the work associated with it is normally outweighs the benefits. It's difficult to do.
Yeah, we've had multiple discussions with groups of broker dealers about putting together best of breed platforms, and you know, if you get 5 or 6 big broker dealers in a room, 4 or 5 of them will tell you they got the best corporate action system on the street.
I've heard it many times.
And it isn't just a discussion point to get over. It turns into a financial point. To Steve's issues, we're injecting the best corporate action system, so we want 27% of the equity in this platform. You've got a fundamental governance problem when people cannot agree on that their corporate actions platform is probably not as good as somebody else's. Therefore, they need to get a lower share of the governance and the equity in the platform. It's a really big showstopper of it.
Being independent helps tremendously in those
Yes.
types of situations because you're not conflicted with, you know, the sharing or whatever. It's like, look, this is what it is. It has a business case. It should stand on its own 2 feet.
Yeah.
And if it does, you're going to buy it because it's functionally rich and it's at the right price, or you're not going to.
Yeah. And Steve, you mentioned it again in your opening address. I think that with run the bank and regulation costs and everything, there's a very narrow, I think you mentioned maybe 20% at
That's
best
maximum, yes.
to innovate and change. Bob, what do you see in terms of, I mean, obviously when you enter into an arrangement of outsourcing or implementing one of your systems,
Which happened very quickly.
which happens very quickly and very efficiently.
You're on record now. That's okay.
But where do you?
I am actually.
Where do you? But how do you help people transform? Because one of the things that I always see is you take an SME, you expect them to run a project, and it can go horribly wrong. What help do you give them, or what advice would
Sure.
you give
Well,
to someone?
the good news is, lessons learned are obviously always very valuable, and we've done, so many. I think we've done over 65 different, transformations over the last 5 years, which is pretty extraordinary globally. So that's around Asia, Europe, and North America, right, which is primarily the markets we serve. And really, it is around, so there's two things. One, if you're changing a platform and you're also outsourcing the people, if you're really doing that, there are advantages and methodologies we work with the client on around actually doing the operations piece first. The value in that is that once, particularly if you're going to be taking on some of the staff to de-risk the situation, they have obviously expertise around understanding the way that they flow their business, the nuances to it. It really does de-risk the situation as you're doing the platform transformation, which does take longer. So that's one of the things that we have worked with clients on is let's do the operational piece first, and then because you can get savings, by the way, so it helps in business cases to be able to get that upfront savings right away, and then work on the technology transformation, which does take longer, particularly if it's a global rollout.
So I guess there's lots of ways of structuring now that
There is.
wasn't there before. And I guess from an Oliver Wyman perspective, you're very happy to help anybody transition and provide that level of expertise.
Well, the first point is to address what kind of transformation they want to perform, understanding the outcome that they want to reach. The transformation or the transition is very complex, but that's not the end of the journey, and that's where we see the frustration of the current players who have outsourced, because again, depending on the market and depending on the software or the supplier, they see that there is some limitation to provide a continuous improvement. And that's the main issue, because it's not just a 2 or 3 years, or sometimes it's not that long for some smaller player, but the investment to transition, the investment to go to the outsourcing is quite high. And the end of the journey is not ending, obviously, when you are on the platform. The end is, can you ensure that you are going to continuously improve your cost and get to the innovation and ensure that it's not just going to be compliant with regulation. And because you have this in mind, it's not that easy, especially as the lessons learned and in some feedback from our client, the frustration is coming so high that they say, no more, just stand by. So this is a challenge, because I think, as we discussed, everyone is looking for very high expectation, and they are just looking for the supply to be at level.
And I
just out of curiosity, because I'd love to add to that, because we actually now contract for those types of issues, so that because they are long term and they are such significant events for those firms, part of the contracting piece does look at whether it's gain sharing, productivity, investment, and that's actually in there, and you have to stand by that. So
for example,
firms didn't ask for that previously. Now I would say it's kind of the standard operating model is that you have to have thoughts around what you're going to do around innovation and continuous improvement, and actually contract for that.
Exactly.
Is that why the contract negotiations are so complicated?
I'm going to say it's probably one or two things more than that, but
I just had one final point I wanted.
they're all painful, by the way.
Just one final point I wanted to bring up. We've talked about the need for transformation. We've, there's inherent cost problems, et cetera. Tony, just a few comments from you about the ESMA consultation on delegation.
Yeah, so this one of my current roles is Brexit program manager at the DTCC. So what's emerged very recently, and it's a potentially long range thing, and it may not happen at all. So caveats over, is that the approach towards delegation, which is effectively outsourcing to a third party, such as in Dublin or Luxembourg, or internal outsourcing to another part of the firm, is changing amongst the regulators potentially, particularly in mainland Europe. And so what we've seen recently is that delegation cannot be assumed to be allowed under the post-Brexit environment. And it's incredibly extensively used in the buy side at the moment, in that you have a Luxembourg or Dublin fund or a UK fund an awful lot of the processes of the core processes of fund management are not done in that location
Yeah.
where it's domiciled. So if the regulatory approach to that changes, and they say, well, okay, it's a Luxembourg fund, where are the fund managers? Where's the compliance department? And they're not there. They're in London or in Edinburgh or Stockholm or Boston or Baltimore or Hong Kong quite a lot of the time. Then this is another aspect of the wider issue of outsourcing that probably needs to be taken into account. It's post-Brexit location policy we're mostly globally distributed companies. It's an issue for all of us.
So
We
it's
don't do a single function all in one place. We spread it around according to our organisation's footprint.
So we would encourage everyone to read those ESMA papers
Yeah,
because that
keep
could
watching
have
that subject. Yes,
yeah, keep watching it because it could have a profound effect on the whole.
Nigel, it's something we should maybe watch and put on the agenda for future meetings.
Well, one of the things, first of all, I'm going to thank you very much for a fantastic panel.